Director of Strategy and a Senior Research Fellow at Multilit Australia. Next to Jennifer is Pasi Sahlberg, who is Professor of Education Policy at the Gonski Institute for Education, and that's out of the University of New South Wales. And on the end is my friend Michelle Michael. She is, her proper title is, well, she's a principal and also an principal education officer at the Department of Education, running the STEM Share community, which is all around information technology director in Australia. So, ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome your panel. Okay, so to kick things off, obviously the topic here is content versus skill. Now, I don't know what your conversations are like in your staff room around this, but my guess is that rarely is it as binary as that, one versus the other. So what I thought we'd do is just open up to the panel. What is your, when you hear content versus skill in education, what are your immediate thoughts? And given that, Ken, you've just got off stage, I thought maybe we'll just give you a little breather, and maybe I'll throw it straight to Jennifer on this one. What do you think of, what do you conceptualise as this content versus skill? Why is there a need to even have a discussion about this?
My experience of that debate is not so much about content, but more usually framed as knowledge. So knowledge versus skill. But as you say, of course, they're not two separate things. They belong together. Skills developed through the acquisition of knowledge and vice versa. So there's a reciprocal relationship between those two things. The debate, I think, comes down to which comes first. So where is the priority in terms of the sequence of learning? Does skill most effectively develop through the acquisition firstly of knowledge, or the teaching of knowledge in which to then build skill upon? Or do you develop knowledge through the application of certain skills? And so that's the debate as I understand it.
Pasi, most people in here will have heard of Finland, and I think you're sometimes regarded as the captain coach of Finland when it comes to education. I'm wondering about what your take on the whole content versus skill debate is, whether it's multifaceted, different layers, or is it a binary in the way that it's been presented on the screen?
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's really too much a binary question, and it's also too much driven by the kind of a teaching point of view. I think for me the more interesting question is, how children learn things in the school, and they don't really care about whether it's a content or knowledge or skills. They ask questions like, what is this for? Can I make something out of these things that we are learning? And learning is much more complex and complicated than just looking at the content and the skills separately. I think one reason why we have ended up in this kind of a sometimes useless debate about which should go first are the organizations like the OECD, for example. If you look at the OECD, the single most powerful international organization in education right now, OECD doesn't have any education strategy. They have a skills strategy. There's a department for skills. And people often, this is policymakers and politicians and education leaders, kind of wrongly believe that because the OECD or the World Bank or the others are doing this, that we also need to put the kind of the skills first, and the content doesn't matter. I think it's a deadly wrong thing. If you look at this whole thing from the practitioners and particularly young people's point of view, they just don't care. They just want to have the answers of what is this thing for, or how can I learn these things in the school? And it's often a kind of a complex mixture of the knowledge of content and the skills.
Michelle?
Pasi's spot on. I'm more interested in how kids learn, what they're thinking when they're doing a particular thing. If we're structured around a curriculum that's trying to plug content, the big debate is which content gets put in, which gets taken out, and why is that content that is in more important than something else? And then things become more important than other things. So I think the answer, there is no answer, they come together, but content versus skills go together. We can't have one or the other. And I was very lucky yesterday. I got to spend the day with Professor Chris Rogers from Tufts University, and he said something to me really interestingly in the car. He said, we're trying to teach, we expect our kids to learn everything that our parents learnt at school, plus all of the knowledge now that they've had to learn, plus everything else that's coming. And it becomes almost a maddening game of which gets added, which gets taken away. and something's got to give.
And I'm curious as to how you, I mean, because you sort of went into it a little bit, but going a little deeper on that, if dance is as important as maths, and we reflect that in the amount of time perhaps we spend on dance and maths, what on earth do we drop in order to make time for these dance activities? Like, how do we reconcile what we teach and what we leave out?
Can I answer the question first?
Please do.
As I was thinking about it. I agree with Jennifer about that it's more often framed as knowledge versus skill. I think probably more specifically what's implied is information versus skill. But for me, one of the reasons that questions like this are put in this way is that our starting point is that there are subjects. And I remember when the national curriculum was introduced into the UK, the Margaret Thatcher's government told us that there were 10 subjects, which was very convenient because there were 5 days in a week, so the time for lunch, think it that way. And so we started to press them on that and say, well, there was no dance in there and there was no drama in there. So I met the education secretary and said, so where is dance in the national curriculum? And without missing a beat, as it were, he said, well, of course, dance is part of PE. Well, it's not. And, I mean, if we had more time, I could go into it, but it's not. And, except contingently. And then I said, well, where's drama? He said, well, drama is part of English. Well, it's not. Because drama is a whole series of arts practices. But the reason we've come to think of it as part of English is because recent history, plays have been written down, and we read the text as if that's the play. But that would be like music lessons consisting entirely of using musical scores and never listening to any actual music or playing anything. So it's just a conceptual confusion about these things, and it's an administrative convenience. I think that discipline is a much better idea, because a subject invites you to think of defining everything in terms of subject matter, i.e. concepts, skills, and information, concepts and information. But mathematics isn't a subject, not in any proper sense. It's a whole set of intellectual skills, of maneuvers, of strategies, of cultural understanding, of particular techniques. It's made of multiple fields and disciplines all of its own. And any mathematician will tell you it's not a subject. It's something they practice. It's not something they study as abstract information. Music is not a subject in that sense either. There's an awful lot of mathematics in music, and an awful lot of music in mathematics. So I was saying last night at dinner that I once asked a professor of pure mathematics how he would assess a PhD in pure mathematics. And I said, presumably it's right. You'd be annoyed, wouldn't you? And 5 years to get a PhD in pure math, it comes back wrong. See me. And he said, no, they're normally right. I said, so how do you judge them? He said, well, there are two big criteria. One is originality, it's how creative it is. And the other is aesthetic. Because mathematicians believe that beauty is an informal test of truth. It's one of the most powerful tests of truth in mathematics. So to me, it's a false distinction from a false starting point. But what does flow from it, these conversations about, well, where do you start? Honestly, it's a more theoretical question than a practical one. I remember the British Secretary, the English Secretary of State for Education, Michael Gove, at one point, having a go at me. And he said, as if anybody ever thought this was true, it can't be created without skill, like this is a controversial idea. Well, of course, nobody ever said that skill was unnecessary to creative work. And he said, you can't be creative in music until you've learned all the skills. And that's just patent nonsense. Because people acquire skills as their interests and ambitions evolve in the practice of the discipline. We played Revolution as I was getting on stage earlier, because I actually wanted to hear it. And I did a book a few years ago called The Element. And one of the people I interviewed for the book was Paul McCartney. And I'm saying that because you should know that. That I hang out with Paul McCartney. But I asked him about the early days of the Beatles, and he said when he and John Lennon formed the band, they had a very rudimentary sense of chord structures. He said, we needed kind of 3 betweens. And then somebody told us there was this guy on the side of Liverpool who knew 2 more. So he said, so we got on the bus and went to his house. And he taught us these are the 2 chords. He said, we went home and started the Beatles. But look at them 10 years on, and they are much more sophisticated as a band.
So I might stay with you if that's all right, Jennifer, because you are fairly vocal on Twitter, and you're on Q&A, and the stuff that you talk about in the public sphere around the kind of alluded to there. You've got to understand how to read, and I know that you're particularly passionate around phonics debate and things of that nature. So I'm interested, given what you just spoke about there, in order to understand the definition, to get a definition, I've got to understand how to read the definition. Is there this is almost a really daft question, but isn't like a bare minimum that we need to get? Or do we just, because if we say, well, it's just more knowledge, we just need to keep giving more knowledge, and we've spoken before, one of the most effective ways to give more knowledge is just to tell people the knowledge, direct instruction, or whatever words we want to use. I'm curious as to how you reconcile that when you're hearing stories around people just discovering things almost by accident, and that constitutes what school should be. What's your...
I think it would be very rare for someone to discover something entirely by accident. It might look like an accident at the time, but more often than not, it's like, to bring it back to a pop culture analogy, your overnight success story, the band or the singer that is apparently an overnight success, but actually they've been writing music and playing for 20 years before they became an overnight success. It's very rare in science. It's very rare to make a discovery that is influential and significant if you've not done a whole lot of work up until you reach that point. I'm not sure I entirely understand the bare minimum question, so I don't know how to answer that.
Well, if we're talking about things being equally important, if we accept that, and then we accept that it's a school's place to help kids discover that, at what point do we say, actually, you know what? So, for example, Ken, you alluded to algebra, and I know that John Hattie, for example, speaks about in some schools in New Zealand, they simply don't go near Shakespeare with certain kids because it's just not what those kids need. I'm interested as to how do you find those nuances about what these kids need at that time? I wonder if anyone does that help? Yeah, sure.
I think there are 2 factors in that decision, and it comes back to what Michelle was saying about what do you keep in and what do you put out, because obviously you can't learn everything in school. I think there's a couple of things there to keep in mind in making those decisions, and obviously that's going to be different from country to country, because there's, in terms of the curriculum, there is empowering knowledge. There are things, knowledge and skills that will empower children as they become adults in various different ways, and some knowledge and skills are more empowering than others. There's an enculturation aspect where you want children to be introduced to the most important things they need to know about their world and then the larger world around them in order to make their way successfully in that world. And there's also keeping in mind what's understood as biologically primary and secondary knowledge. So there is biologically primary knowledge that we are evolved to be more likely to discover on our own or to learn in working in a group. Those are things that we've evolved to learn more quickly because they are useful to us as we have developed as a race. There's biologically secondary knowledge which children are very unlikely to learn without some really expert instruction. They're unlikely to learn it because it's really abstract and complex, and they're unlikely to learn it because actually it's really hard.
I think what's quite right about this is that what's tended to happen in the school reform movement in most countries is that policymakers have focused on the wrong stuff. There are 3 big bits to education, broadly. There's the curriculum, assessment, and teaching. And the assumption has been that if we get the curriculum right and we get these split systems assessment in, everything will be fine. The fact is, you can have fantastic education without a curriculum. You can have really good education with no assessment system that's nationally agreed. What you cannot have is a good school without great teachers facilitating, whether they bear the title or not, because the role of a teacher is to facilitate learning. And this isn't to say we shouldn't have a curriculum or we shouldn't think about assessment, but assessment is a much bigger, better, richer idea than testing. And at the heart of this is pedagogy. It's an art form, and every high-performing system in the world understands that you can't improve education without support from the development, the status, and the professionalism of teachers. And this is where the whole thing starts to go wrong, because politicians think they can improve education by remote control, by making it teacher-proof. But all these day-to-day judgments, like parenting, depend entirely on a teacher understanding what's happening right in front of them, what's going to work with this child now. And instead, the debate becomes followed. Is it direct instruction? Is it learning by discovery? Is it individual work? Is it group work? These are not polarities. These are part of the repertory that great teachers have at their disposal in knowing how to put together the right context for learning for these kids here and now in this setting. And if we invested more in the professionalism of teachers and their development as teachers, a lot of these theoretical start to resolve themselves.